You're listening to a Tax Justice UK podcast. I'm Naomi Fowler, and today I'm talking to Emeritus Professor at Lancaster University Law School, Sol Picciotto of the BEPS Monitoring Group, which is a group established to monitor the BEPS Action Plan for the reform of the taxation of transnational corporations. We're discussing his chapter today in Tax Justice UK's publication Tax Takes, which you can read on www.taxjustice.uk/tax-takes. Tax Takes has 9 chapters on ways the UK's tax system could be reformed to make it more progressive and more effective. We apologise for the quality of the line in places, but here's Sol Picciotto on his chapter, Stopping Competition for Corporate Investment Through Tax Cuts and Giveaways. Let's start with two of the major problems in the ways governments have tried to tackle reform in taxation, which you highlight. You say that there's been weak coordination between states and governments have often been ambivalent in their policies to the point of hypocrisy. So what do you mean by that, and what are the forces driving it, do you think?
Yes, well, the main effort to reform international tax rules really resulted from strong political pressures on government, obviously especially after the great financial crisis and the austerity in many countries. So eventually it was through the G20 world leaders that they initiated what they call the Project on Base Erosion and Profit Shifting, the BEPS project. But they handed the job over to the tax specialists working through the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. And the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, Fiscal Affairs Committee, is actually the people from national governments, plus officials recruited mostly from governments to work at the OECD in Paris. They're the people who have been the main custodians of international tax rules for the last 30, 40 years. But in particular in the last 10 or 20 years, had let them become really very dysfunctional, as was highlighted, I think, by a lot of the exposés, both by tax justice campaigners and many journalists, showing how multinationals are really fairly easily able to shift profits out of countries where they might be significantly taxed and put them into likely low tax jurisdictions, not only the historical classic tax havens like Cayman Islands, but also low tax jurisdictions like Ireland, Luxembourg. So the effort was supposed to be to try and reform these international rules, and the G20 leaders made a big play of that. If I may talk about the UK, where I'm mainly based, in particular, the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, made a big play about how he was taking a lead back in 2012. And that led to the summit first of the G8 leaders and then the G20 leaders in St. Petersburg in 2013, which gave a mandate to the OECD for these major reforms. Now, the mandate given from the political leaders was to change the rules so that multinationals would be taxed where their economic activities occur and value is created. That's a quote from the St. Petersburg Tax Declaration. So really, the idea should be to treat multinationals in accordance with their economic or business reality. We understand a company like Apple or Amazon, or for that matter Ford Motor, or these big multinationals, as single entities, which in fact they are. They are organised centrally, they operate on an integrated way around the world. But from a legal point of view, they set up often hundreds of different subsidiaries and other affiliates, often in low tax jurisdictions, and so they shift money around between these different legal entities. But this should have been an effort to reform the rules to tax them where the economic activities really take place. But unfortunately, the tax specialists mostly, they wanted to satisfy their governments by coming up with something, so they did come up with a package after a couple of years of work, delivered in 2015, but that package really went well short of resolving the problems, and in fact some of the key issues are still being worked on now. So the package did deliver a number of reforms. They gave some stronger powers to many of the tax authorities. If they had the resources, obviously many of the revenue authorities don't have enough resources anyway to do a job properly. But they did strengthen the rules, but they really didn't take any kind of radical new approach. And this was because the negotiating parties, they had to reach consensus, and then each government had its own kind of red lines. Each government, while saying they wanted a reform, really tried to safeguard its own positions. So, for example, in the United States, at that time it was the Obama administration, but working with a Republican Congress. So it was fairly clear that their mandate to their negotiators was there shouldn't be any changes for which there'd have to be major legal changes in the US, which would have to go through the Congress because they couldn't deliver on it. So that was a red line for the United States. Other countries had their own preferred solutions. So I'll concentrate mainly on the United Kingdom tax.
Right, because if we look at the British government's behaviour around the BEPS negotiations, on the one hand it's been saying it supports international efforts to coordinate tax reform, and then on the other hand it's been introducing these so-called incentives supposed to make the country competitive by attracting investment in terms of reducing the corporate tax rate from 28%, due to hit 17% by 2020, presumably trying to match Ireland's 12.5% rate. They've exempted UK resident companies mostly from tax on their foreign profits, and they've introduced a patent box, which gives a 10% tax rate on profits from products using a patent. So they're talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it was fairly clear because they did issue a Treasury paper in 2014, a year or so after the initial start of the BEPS negotiations, which made that clear. That on the one hand they said, we want to reform the rules, but then it also made clear that the mandate to the negotiators was to preserve the United Kingdom's competitive tax system. And it was no secret, because I coordinate an international group of researchers called the BEPS Monitoring Group, and we followed the BEPS process very closely. We issued comments on all the consultation documents and attended the public consultations. And following it fairly closely, it was absolutely no secret. The UK drew red lines and blocked some of the major changes. In particular, the patent box that you just mentioned, that hindered negotiations for over a year. Now, I have to say, the UK is not the only one to have introduced it. It wasn't the first. The UK was kind of joining what other countries had already started a number of years before. Various countries had introduced incentives for research and development. And certainly many countries do have incentives for research and development which essentially allow you to write off actual investments for research. Where the patent box, I think, was particularly damaging incentive was it had nothing to do really with the investment in research. It gave a low tax rate, in the UK's case 10%, to the income or profits from any product that incorporated a patent. So, for example, if you patented a new printer cartridge for a printer, a home printer, for example, all the profits from selling printers would get this 10% low rate. But also, the patent in the original version from the UK, the patent only had to be transferred to a UK company. So the UK tried to defend this blatant tax incentive, really, against the tax, particularly from Germany. In the end, there was a compromise which tried to ensure that the expenditure on developing the patent had to be linked to the income. So they did introduce a restriction on it, but it took, as I say, most of the negotiations around one of the action points of the BEPS action plan, nearly a year, and at the end they didn't say, no, you should phase out the patent box. They said it should come into line. Well, the problem then is that once it had been approved, albeit with these modifications, a number of other countries said, okay, if that's accepted, then we better have one too. So not only did the UK defend its own tax break with some modifications, but then other countries all jumped in. So Italy's now subsequently introduced one, Switzerland introduced one, Ireland's introduced one. So although there's a bit of a break on them, at the same time it's a green light for any country that wants to have one, which each country can say is compatible with the rules. The rules that they developed on so-called harmful tax practices really are rather moderate. They're not legally binding. There's a form of peer review to supervise them, which takes a certain amount of time. They've just issued a new report, actually, on the harmful tax practices, which is trying to phase out some of those practices. But it's really a very, very weak form of coordination on the tax breaks that countries are giving. And that was largely because the UK negotiators were given fairly clear political instructions to defend the UK tax break.
Right, and it's a very hard to get rid of this idea about competition between nations. So hard to challenge it. It's the idea that it brings more investment, creates new jobs and all that kind of thing. And, you have to ask what kind of reform a country is really looking for when so many of them are clearly not willing to give up on this kind of race to the bottom that you've been describing. I mean, the UK's made it quite clear that its so-called competitive tax system is just not up for debate.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So that includes not only reducing the corporate tax rate, they seem to want to bring it down as close as possible to Ireland's 12.5% rate. So as you've already said, it's come down from 28, down now to 19, headed towards 17 under the current government, unless we get a change in government, of course. So the tax rate they want to reduce, but then these special tax breaks for patent boxes. But also the other change they introduced in 2012, at the same time they were saying they were going to join this international effort, was that they greatly weakened the rules on taxing of overseas profits. So the UK used to have rules on so-called controlled foreign corporations, which allows the country to tax profits made by the foreign subsidiaries of a British firm. And this would stop them parking profits overseas. Now, the US used to have quite strong rules, and the US weakened their controlled foreign corporation rules through what's called the check-the-box system. So then the UK kind of, in a way, followed suit. So in 2012, even more aggressively, in fact, than the US. In 2012, the UK largely went to a territorial system where they promised that any headquarter company set up in the UK wouldn't be taxed on its overseas profit unless it was diverting profit from the UK. But that gives them a free hand to minimise their tax in other countries and divert profits between other countries. So it was really a blatant play to attract, and now it could be, multinationals ultimately based in other countries. So it's not really a very satisfactory way to go about an international tax reform. The whole BEPS package really is a very unsatisfactory set of sticking plasters really put on some gaping wounds in the international tax system. And in fact, some of the major action points of the BEPS process were left incomplete.
As you say, you've been monitoring the BEPS process through the BEPS monitoring group for a long time. As you say, it hasn't ensured that multinationals are taxed actually where economic activities occur and where value is created. I'm wondering if you have a comment about the effect this unilateralism that you've identified with the United Kingdom in terms of Brexit.
Well, I mean, the BEPS is through the G20 and the OECD, so that's not directly affected by Brexit. Brexit would have an effect on how far the EU might develop a common approach. There are proposals within the EU to have a more sensible approach, the so-called Common Consolidated Corporate Tax Base, the CCCTB, and this would, for the first time, between countries, introduce a system which would treat the multinationals as a single entity and apportion their profits amongst the countries based on a formula reflecting their real presence in each country, their employees and sales and assets. So CCCTB is a proposal, but unfortunately only within the EU. It would still allow the companies to divert profits outside the EU, so it's only a partial solution. We've actually commented, and this is still a proposal being debated currently by the European Parliament. We issued a comment on that, and we urged the European parliamentarians to modify it so it could be done on a global basis. It should be possible for the EU to start with the company's global worldwide profit, then do an apportionment of the profit to the EU, and then re-divide the profits between the EU countries. That will be one way of stopping diversion of profits outside the EU. Now, I'm glad to say that some of the parliamentarians listened to what we have to say, and there is an amendment asking the European Commission to try and work out more detailed proposals along those lines. So that, I think, is the direction that they should go in. Now, it's possible with Brexit, with the UK no longer acting as a brake, it's possible that the remaining EU states, or at least a majority of them, it could go ahead with on an accelerated procedure with not necessarily all the remaining 27 states. It's possible they may go ahead with the CCCTB, and that might act as some pressure on other countries, if the UK were outside the EU by then, really to rethink their approach. So the EU as a bloc, I think, could act as a catalyst if it were willing to act as a bloc. And as I say, until now the UK has been a bit of a break on that. So it's possible without the UK in there acting as a break that the others might. But actually, frankly, I doubt it. I don't think Brexit will make that much of a difference. It's hard enough to get even 8 or 9 EU states to agree. But the solutions are global solutions that we need to look to, and all states would gain by a more comprehensive revision.
Right, because you make a series of recommendations. Among them, you say withdrawing the patent box low tax rate, which would be good. And I mean, that alone would save over 900 million a year for taxpayers in the UK. Reversing the recent cuts in corporation tax, and you're suggesting a move towards 25%, something that other major economies are converging around. And there's a whole series of other recommendations. I wonder if you can explain a bit about the public review of the tax treaty policies, especially in relation to developing countries.
Yes, I think if governments really set their face against this idea that you have to offer tax breaks to multinationals in order to get investment, I think that really is a mistake. And a number of economists like Paul Krugman or Mariana Mazzucato and others have pointed out that really multinationals are not necessarily the source of dynamism or innovation. Entrepreneurialism comes really more from small business and from dynamic startups. What the tax breaks that multinationals enables them to do is to actually set out on the acquisitions trail. They acquire smaller companies. To offer tax breaks to multinationals really is pointless. They're sitting on large cash piles anyway that they don't know how to invest. The Trump administration is now considering giving them a tax break to persuade the American-based multinationals to repatriate I think it's now $2.5 trillion that the large American multinationals are sitting on. We know the data for the US, but there must be similar cash piles that British-based and other multinationals are sitting on. So the idea that you need tax incentives to encourage multinationals to invest is really a myth. They're sitting on large amounts of cash, which they don't know how to invest profitably. They spend large amounts of it buying up other companies. It's really the small companies that need these investments. So what government should do is to move away from these ideas that you need to give tax breaks either to large companies or to wealthy individuals for them to invest, and move towards a more cooperative effort. So to phase out incentives like the patent box, to converge towards a reasonable rate of corporate taxation. As I say, there does seem to be some convergence on a rate of around 20-25%. Certainly the Labour opposition in the UK have said that would be their policy. Because as I say, the BEPS process has not finished. On the issue of transfer pricing, they didn't complete work on some of the accepted methods of transfer pricing, which could provide a way of moving away from this damaging independent entity principle. They're working still on the so-called profit split method. And the profit split method could be a step towards an apportionment approach. The profit split method allows you to aggregate or total the profits of related companies instead of treating them as if they were independent, just to aggregate them and then allocate them amongst those related companies according to so-called allocation keys reflecting real activity in the different countries. So that would be a step towards a comprehensive system of form reapportionment. The OECD is actually having a hearing on this in a couple of weeks' time, and we'll be represented there and putting forward some proposals to move in that direction. Now, I think there will be strong resistance to this from both tax advisors, obviously for many multinational companies, but also quite likely a lot of the revenue authorities, because frankly many of them have invested a lot in the current systems, the current complicated rules, give them a living in a way, if you like. So it's very hard for them to think outside the box, but we would urge them to move in this direction. I mean, the other main area is, in fact, Action 1 of the BEPS project was to look at the tax consequences of the digital economy. And there, the report they gave in 2015 said that they hadn't really been able to do any more than analyse the nature of the problem, and they asked for 5 more years to resolve the problem. Now, because of political pressures, the G20 governments have pushed for more to be done, so the OECD is now working on a report that the G20 has called for to be delivered next year, in 2018. So again, they've got consultations, and we've made a submission. So really, on the digitalised economy, now the digitalised economy, it's not a matter of, and they recognise it, the analysis in the Action 1 report of the BEPS project is pretty good, I think. It shows that it's not a matter of some companies being digitalised and others not. It's the whole economy has become digitalised. Whole swathes of economic sectors have shifted over. Obviously, there's still quite a lot of analog, but it's the combination of the two. Many of the so-called digital companies also do very well out of selling hardware, obviously Apple. So these companies are not purely in the ether. I mean, Apple has these familiar Apple stores all over the place. So they do very well by combining the communication facilities that digitalization gives you with presence in different countries. So really what they've done is to sharpen up, to throw into sharper relief, if you like, the defects of the current rules. So the OECD really, and the tax authorities negotiating through the OECD, really need to up the game and to really start to shift towards a more comprehensive approach. And the digitalised economy context might be one in which they could and should do that.
And that leads me to my last question then. You've been monitoring international tax reform for a long time. What's your hunch on where this is going in terms of time before we might see something like the Common Consolidated Corporate Tax Base, which would address the digitalised economy very effectively? How long? I know it's like asking how blue is the sky, how long is a piece of string, but what is your hunch about how long it's going to take to get us there?
Well, what I would say mainly is that it really all depends on political pressure, on public opinion. The main reason that the tax specialists have been forced, I mean, although as I've said fairly clearly, what they've done so far really is a patch-up job, nevertheless the last 3 or 4 years have been unprecedented in the comprehensive, in the changes that they put forward. Compared to the previous 25 years, well, in fact, most of the changes went in the other direction. So certainly in the last, let's say 5 years, since 2012, really very, very significant changes have been made. And the tax authorities are probably right to say, well, they're getting in some hundreds of millions more from multinationals. But it's maybe like turning around an ocean liner that was really headed in completely the wrong direction, strengthening the arm's length principle, and it's very slow to turn it around. How quickly, and what will be my prediction, as I say, I think it entirely depends on public pressure, but also on public awareness. A big problem is that there's a lot of both misinformation, I wouldn't say bad news, but I'd say misinformation, but also a lot of this is shrouded in a lot of technical detail, which is why in the BEPS monitoring group we've tried to follow it and put out our reports hopefully in language that most people can understand, maybe with a bit of effort. We try and make them as clear as possible. So what we would urge people, activists particularly, is to really keep up pressure on their political representatives by showing their knowledge of the details of what's being proposed. Often, even politicians seem to think, the problems have been solved by the BEPS process. Far from it. The key issues are still under negotiation, and they certainly have done no more than patch up the rules. There are still these unilateral measures, like diverted profit tax. Even at the EU level now, France and Germany have proposed equalisation levy. India introduced one. So at the moment, really, there's all to play for. And how quickly we get change, I think, largely depends on the pressures from public opinion, and particularly activists who really get involved and inform themselves about the issues and keep up informed pressure.
I've been talking to Sol Picciotto. Once again, you can read this publication, Tax Takes, on www.taxjustice.uk/tax-takes. Thanks for listening.